Peta undercover investigators exposed animal abuse at the world-renowned Cleveland Clinic, and now it could cost that institute $100 million in federal funds. That's next on the Peta Podcast. Welcome to the Peta Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at Peta, the largest animal rights organization in the world. The Cleveland Clinic is a big institution that can do exemplary work, like Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn's work on veganism, also the aggressive actions during the COVID crisis by the clinic. But now a Peta undercover investigation has documented flagrant animal abuse involving laboratory mice at the Cleveland Clinic's Lerner College of Medicine. The result is a 42-page complaint filed with the National Institutes of Health that now says it will question if any of the violations could end the $100 million in federal dollars that it gives the Cleveland Clinic. The examples of abuse include the cutting into the heads of mice, the lack of pain relief, and video of mice found dead in cages. Dr. Alka Chandna is a Peta vice president in the Laboratory Investigation Department. The investigation has shaken up Cleveland after the local newspaper, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, did a fair and thorough report of what Peta found. Here's our conversation on the Peta Podcast. I have the Cleveland.com, the article from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. It's quite an article about your investigation, and it's really I really think it's a rare time that journalism has dealt fairly with Peta. And so, first of all, Alka, congratulations on the investigation. But what did you think about that article in Cleveland.com? I thought it was pretty fair, no?
Yeah, we were very happy with the coverage. The reporter took great pains to go through our complaint and our evidence, the evidence that we'd compiled through the investigation. And she took a lot of effort to really understand what the regulations and guidelines are as they pertain to the use of mice and rats in experimentation. So I thought, she went into the policy, she went into the concerns that we had, the illegal treatment of mice and rats, meaning, the fact that Cleveland Clinic experimenters were depriving these animals of veterinary care, safe housing, relief from pain and distress, and even humane euthanasia. And she did a really good job, I thought, of getting into the nuts and bolts of all of those issues to try to allow the public to understand what the issues were.
See, and this is why I think I would like to dwell on the article a little longer than I normally do, only because I think it's a blueprint for how journalists can look at Peta, because so many times journalists look at Peta with a jaundiced eye and say, "Oh, you guys are worse than activists." They think that they're publicity hounds. They're very suspicious, and to get a fair-minded article is a rare thing, I think, in these days in journalism, especially when all the news is skewed toward COVID. But going to the Cleveland.com article, the headline: Peta accuses Cleveland Clinic of abusing lab mice after undercover investigation. And this is an article by Mary Kilpatrick of Cleveland.com. A fairly plain kind of headline, but that means it's not sensationalistic. It puts Peta right there. There's no question about it. Peta is the accuser. Cleveland Clinic, and this is what got me. Cleveland Clinic is a big deal in the Cleveland area. And when you go after someone as big as the Cleveland Clinic and you're the hometown paper and you're playing it fair, I think that bodes well for journalism in Cleveland. I hope that people support the paper. But let me just read the lead here. People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals is accusing the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine of violating federal policy by mistreating laboratory mice, and the group wants the National Institutes of Health to investigate. very good, solid lead. You're the accuser. Peta's the accuser. You're accusing the big college there at Cleveland Clinic, and you want the investigation. Here's the second graph. The mice at the clinic, quote, suffered as a result of neglect, incompetence, and a culture of disregard for their welfare, Peta wrote in a May 7th letter and report to the NIH Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, which evaluates compliance with the policy on humane care and use of laboratory animals. Peta and the letter asked the agency to investigate the clinic's use and treatment of animals in these labs. Experimenters cut holes into some of the mice's heads and placed a piece of glass over their brains and attached hardware to the window. Peta says, quote, several mice used in this study were found dead in the cages in which they were confined, end quote, according to Peta. Now, those are the three graphs. In most people who know journalism, who study journalism, most people who read newspapers still, they get the first three graphs and that's it. And I think in those first three graphs, it very fairly balanced the story. You've made the accusation. Here's the clinic. You're asking for an investigation by the NIH. Is the NIH Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare going to investigate?
Yes, Emil, I'm happy to report that over the weekend, I received an email from the director of oversight at NIH, and he informed me that they would be opening an investigation into our concerns and allegations. So, we look forward to seeing what comes of that.
Now, a lot of people would hear those first three graphs that I read and say, oh, the mice at the clinic suffered as a result of neglect, incompetence, and culture of disregard for their welfare, according to Peta. And a lot of people might say, come on, mice? Really? Mice? And what do you say to people who don't hold mice in high regard?
Well, I suppose there are a few things to say there. The first is, let's check our prejudices at the door. Why would you have such little regard for mice? What do you know about mice? And if we look at the literature, it's crystal clear that mice are mammals. They feel pain and they suffer just as we do, just as any dog or cat would do. They may be small in size. We may have all manner of prejudices against them. But when we look at the science, we see that they feel pain and they suffer. And so then the next question becomes, let's say we don't care about animals at all. Why should we care about this? Why should we care about the mistreatment of these animals? And the answer is a number, $100 million. And that's how much money Cleveland Clinic got from the National Institutes of Health last year in 2019. This is taxpayer money that went to Cleveland Clinic, $100 million, and approximately half of that is estimated to go to animal experiments. Most of those experiments are on mice and rats. Now, these experimenters ostensibly are using mice and rats to understand human disease. But if they are mistreating these animals, you're taking a methodology that's already rife with problems, looking at mice to understand human beings, already rife with problems, and you're making it even more problematic because you're introducing all kinds of confounding factors for the fact that you're failing to give these animals pain relief. So their pain is going to influence their biology. You're failing to euthanize animals in a timely manner, and that skews your data. You're failing to provide veterinary care. Again, it skews your data. So what comes out of mistreatment of animals is science that is even less rigorous, even less reliable than what you started with, which was already problematic.
Yeah. Right.
So from the sheer standpoint of the investment of public money into this enterprise, we should be concerned about mistreatment of animals.
Now, the funny thing about this article, it doesn't even get into the 100 million part yet. I mean, you just mentioned it now, but I mean, it does, though, talk about the mistreatment of mice. It talks about how holes are cut into the heads of mice and a piece of glass over their brains and attached to hardware to
to the window. I mean, there's a lot of, and this is really not the gory stuff either. I mean, it sounds pretty horrid, but it gets even more horrific. Several mice used were found dead in the cages. It sounds like there was just a lack of disregard for the welfare of the mice at all.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the central issue with animal experimentation, I think, is that the animals are viewed not as animals. And, this is true whether we're talking about monkeys or dogs, cats, mice, rats, rabbits, any of these animals. The notion that they're feeling, living beings who feel pain and suffer, that notion has gone out the window. It just does not exist in those buildings because the central idea when you use animals in experimentation is that those animals are quote unquote models. They're models for disease. And this was on full display at Cleveland Clinic. If I can go on, I'd like to share an example. Thanks.
Yeah, please.
So one of the experimenters at Cleveland Clinic, what she does is she purposely breeds mice. It's selective breeding. So that the mice are prone to pelvic organ prolapse. This means that organs in the pelvic area, we're talking about the rectum, the uterus, the vagina, those sorts of organs, that they would come out, they would protrude, prolapse out of the body. So internal organs go out of the body. And so she is breeding animals, so mice, so that they have these prolapses. And, we see in the video footage that's at PETA.org, we see these mice walking very gingerly, and you can see that their back legs are spread out, and it seems that they're trying to avoid touching the organ that has come out of their body. And we know from human experience that people who suffer with pelvic area prolapse, they report pain and distress and discomfort. So those sorts of things we can assume would also be suffered by mice who have pelvic area organ prolapse. And yet when the investigator was speaking with one of the experimenters working on this project, and the investigator asked about the pain of the animals, the pain of the mice, the experimenter responded, "That's our model. That's what we breed them for." So it's a very deliberate decision. I mean, it sort of sends shivers up my spine to think that somebody, was sitting in their laboratory and writing in a notepad and deciding, okay, I'm going to breed these animals so they have this debilitating condition that causes pain and causes suffering. And then when they're asked about this, they just, dismiss the concerns. They dismiss the ethical concerns by saying, that is our model. So the notion of the model trumps the fact that these are animals who feel pain and suffer.
You mentioned an investigator, someone there undercover. They were hired legally by the clinic. They were there. They were working legally, correct?
That's exactly right. Yes, they were hired there as a husbandry technician.
And this is pretty standard that what PETA does. And yet there was no, and this is, I guess, how you got the video, or did you get the video through Freedom of Information Act, or was the video taken while this investigator was there working?
Yes, the investigator took the video footage while they were there working in the laboratories.
And so the investigator talks to the scientist. The scientist says, "This is our model. This is the way we do things." How does that jibe with the Animal Welfare Act, or what NIH presumably may, be looking to see if things were, followed according to the rules, in terms of research? How does it come? How does what Cleveland Clinic did and what your investigator saw? How does it all add up?
Right. Well, first of all, the Animal Welfare Act, tragically, frustratingly, and absurdly, the Animal Welfare Act, which is the single federal law in the United States that has standards, legally enforceable standards that govern the treatment of animals in laboratories. That law explicitly excludes mice and rats and other animals from the Animal Welfare Act. In fact, from the definition of animal in the Animal Welfare Act. This was done at the behest of the animal experimentation industry. They're a well-heeled industry and have pretty loud voices. They don't reflect the majority of Americans, but they do reflect well-heeled interests. Everybody from the people who produce the cages to make the kibble to sell the animals to this industry.
Right. I think I knew that, and I just as you were mentioning it, I realized why I asked the question, because it would seem absurd that the mice would be left out. The mice are they're the people, or the people. They're the beings that are victimized in the process of experimentation. So if that's the case, if they're left out of the Animal Welfare Act, what is your recourse? What can you hope that the NIH would do? Where are the rules, and how can the mice be protected going forward?
Well, tragically, the protections are threadbare, but there is an avenue forward. And that's that in this patchwork of regulations and guidelines, policies, and so on that we have in the United States, there is something called the Health Research Extension Act of 1985. Now, if you think about that year, 1985, it was that law came into place because of PETA's work in the early years. And that law basically says that for any vertebrate animals, and of course, mice and rats are vertebrates, for any vertebrate animals used in federally funded experimentation, that experimentation should proceed only if it follows certain guidelines and policies. So there are guidelines and policies prescribed in various texts, the Guide for the Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, and something called Public Health Service Policy on humane care and treatment of animals in laboratories. So under these texts, there are certain prescribed treatments, and those include such things as pain, discomfort, distress to animals should be minimized. That sort of language exists there. The problem is that those guidelines and policies don't have the force of law behind them in the same way. If you look at the Animal Welfare Act, and not to get too wonky, but if you look at the Animal Welfare Act, there are regulations that go along with the act. And those regulations include things like pain, distress, discomfort should be minimized. Analgesia, pain relief should be used unless it interferes with the scientific objectives of the experiments, things like that. Those regulations have the force of law behind them. So if a laboratory fails to adhere to those regulations, there are legal channels to pursue that and to get, for example, stipulations, fines, given to the facility. There can be those sorts of penalties that have this legal dimension. But with the Health Research Extension Act of 1985 and the policies and guidelines that go along with it, the policies and the guidelines don't have that kind of authority. So there are no stipulations, no fines that can be meted out. And so it sort of becomes like a different game in that regard.
You can stop them from doing.
What we can do is complain to the National Institutes of Health, which is what we've done. We've submitted our complaint there, and they have said that they're going to investigate. And what the NIH now is authorized to do is it can say, well, these particular experiments did not comply with the Health Research and Extension Act of 1985, did not comply with the guide. Therefore, we are going to pull funding. So the NIH can pull grant funding. That's what they can do. They can't slap a fine, but they can pull funding. And they can even go further than that, and they can remove an entire institution's ability to receive funding by simply removing something called an assurance, which is what permits institutions like Cleveland Clinic to get NIH funding in the first place.
So what's interesting is that we have this law that permits this kind of torture on mice. What's the species level? What's the species cutoff? You can do it to mice, but at what point do they start taking offense at the Animal Welfare Act? At what point do they say, "Oh, this animal's for real"?
Right. Well, the Animal Welfare Act, the way they define animal is they say all warm-blooded animals. So right away, amphibians, reptiles are excluded. And then the Animal Welfare Act, and also invertebrates are excluded. The Animal Welfare Act then explicitly excludes from the definition of animal mice, and I should say mice of the genus Mus, rats of the genus Rattus. And these are the majority of mice and rats who are bred for experimentation. So that's the categories we're talking about regarding mice and rats. But then there are certain mice like certain field mice who would be included. There's no science here. It's all just random. I shouldn't say random, but these divisions that have been made based on what the industry wanted. Mice and rats who are bred for experimentation. I'll just finish this one thing. Birds who are bred for experimentation are also excluded, but wild caught birds are included in the Animal Welfare Act. Fishes are all excluded. And as I said before, amphibians and reptiles are excluded, and invertebrates are excluded. And also, this is a really weird one. Agricultural animals who are used in agricultural experiments are excluded. But if those agricultural animals, meaning animals who are generally thought of as used in agriculture, if those animals are used in other experiments that are non-agricultural in scope, then they're included. I mean, it's just a bizarre, unscientific set of divisions.
Yeah, carved out by the lobbyists. So in the ag animal thing, how about a pig? You could test on pigs if you want.
Well, if you used a pig in, let's say, a burn experiment, which is how a lot of pigs are used in burn experiments where they deliver third-degree burns over a substantial portion of their bodies. If you use the pig in a burn experiment and you're doing that to understand human burns, forget the fact that, it doesn't really apply. But in any case, if that's what you're doing, then that pig is covered under the Animal Welfare Act. But if you're using the pig to understand, say, gestation crates on factory farms and how many, how much square footage should you, or I should say, how many square inches should you give to that female pig so that she can sit there for the number of months that she's going to be gestating without, causing, let's say, certain types of sores. Well, that pig, because she's being used in agricultural experiments that have relevance to the agricultural sector, she will not be covered under the Animal Welfare Act. It's just like this bizarre, and as you say, defined by the lobbyists. That's where these definitions have come about.
Right. So the animals need a better lobbyist, or the animals, and good thing for PETA that they're out there advocating for the animals. But we need better laws is really the answer. But now we have this other law that you mentioned that you're going to go after the Cleveland Clinic with, and it really goes to the heart of what makes the Cleveland Clinic do what it does, and that is they get money. $100 million is a lot of money to feed otherwise unemployed scientists who are looking for animals to torture for their scientific whims, as it turns out. And so here's what the Cleveland Clinic said in this Cleveland.com report, because they released a statement and they said, quote, "We take these matters seriously and are committed to integrity in research and to the humane treatment of animals for research and medical education. Our research program consistently meets rigorous institutional and federal regulatory requirements. The occurrences and conditions alleged in the PETA letter are inaccurate and misrepresented." according to a statement from the Cleveland Clinic. So that was the balance that was in the Cleveland.com article. Alka, what is PETA's response to that?
Well, I would think that the Cleveland Clinic probably barely looked at PETA's 42-page report that went to the National Institutes of Health. It was a 42-page detailed document with a 2-page cover letter. And we detailed documentation of mice and rats who were denied veterinary care, of technicians who looked the other way, of veterinary technicians who didn't bother writing up concerns, systematic abuse of these animals. For example, you referenced earlier the craniotomies that were conducted on mice, and rats are subjected to these surgeries as well, where the experimenters cut an incision into the animal's head, open it up, carve out a portion of the skull to expose the brain, and then some may suction out portions of the brain, and then they put that glass lid on top of the exposed brain. That's called a craniotomy. And human beings who have been subjected to craniotomies, if they had some kind of neural condition, they talk about getting pain relief for a protracted period after the surgery. And it's very strong pain medication. Because this is not, you can well imagine if you're subjected to that sort of invasive surgery that it must produce a lot of pain. But these mice who the investigator saw, they were given pain relief for 2 days, the day of the surgery and the day after, and that was it. So if you consider this, and that was what was written on the cage cards, that was what was delivered to the animals. That was what was stipulated in the protocol. So what this means is that when the animal experimenter dreamt up this horrible Frankensteinian experiment, this invasive, painful surgery on these animals for the pure reason of curiosity, when they dreamt that up, they wrote up their protocol, they submitted it to the oversight body, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, and that body sat down. You have a body of, some number of people, including a veterinarian, who sat there, looked at this protocol, saw what was going to happen to the mice, and thought, okay, yeah, 2 days of pain relief, that's fine. And they took their rubber stamp and they stamped that document. So this is the sort of thing we're talking about. It's a systemic problem at Cleveland Clinic. It's not just a couple of bad apples. It's not just a couple of particularly sadistic experiments. It's through and through that institution has problems. I'll give you another example. At the Cleveland Clinic, they breed a lot of mice because, they have all of these experimenters who are arrayed there, and they want mice for their experiments. So they're constantly breeding mice. Now, what they do is they will have the female mouse, the male mouse, and they often have what they call harems. So a male and a couple of females. And they then have these litters of, they're called mouse pups. They have these litters of baby mice who are produced in the cage. These are shoebox cages. They're the size of a shoebox. They're plastic cages, and obviously quite small. And what was happening is because they're so invested in having lots and lots of mice being produced, they'll allow multiple litters of mice to be born into a cage. And then one litter might be a little bit older, the other a little bit younger. The mice are already stressed because of this insane confinement. The adult mice are not able to travel as much as they would in nature. They have no control over what happens in their lives. They can't control the temperature. They can't build nests effectively. They can't get away from perhaps aggressive mice in the cage. Their lives are just stressful. Everything about their lives is artificial. And so when you have multiple litters being born, which is what was happening that our investigator documented, then you're going to have some of the adults accidentally trampling on these baby mice. sometimes the stress is so great that we see baby mice are basically killed because of the trampling. And the conditions are so stressful that they're cannibalized. This is not something that the investigator documented once or twice. It was happening almost every other day. This is no exaggeration. And, one of the things that I really give the investigations team at PETA a lot of credit for is they are so diligent about, writing down the dates and what the cage number was and what the room number was and who the experimenter was, where were these things happening? And that's reflected in that 42-page complaint. This is not a flimsy document where we're sort of, waving our hands and saying, well, there was this problem, that problem, and I think this happened too. No, we're saying this is the date, this is the time, this is what happened. We saw cannibalizations, we saw they have the what they're called hydropacks in the cages, and this is how the water is delivered to the mice. But these leak. And, sometimes they would leak and the cages would become wet. And sometimes the animals would die, either because of hypothermia or even drowning. That has happened. Or the cages just become wet and the animals become extremely uncomfortable. The mice are small and they already experience cold stress in laboratories. The rooms are kept at a temperature which is lower than what mice would find comfortable. So, if any of your listeners are like me, always cold, I'm always cold.
Right.
You turn the AC on and I'm cold. And in the wintertime, I'm cold. I can get a blanket. I can put on extra sweaters, but these mice don't have that ability. So they're already on the edge of being unwell even before any kind of illness or condition is induced in them. And then you have these hydropacks leaking all the time. I wrote that complaint and it was challenging to get all of the incidents into that complaint. And in fact, we didn't put in all of the incidents of hydropacks leaking because there were just too many. This is the issue, that the problems in that facility are overwhelming. And the problems are systemic. You start with these experimenters and the god awful experiments that are done for the sake of curiosity. None of these experiments are ever going to lead to human therapies. If we believe the data that comes out of the National Institutes of Health and the Food and Drug Administration from Stanford University, none of these experiments are going to help one human being, one iota. And yet animals are being tormented, they're being killed, they're being held in horrible conditions, and they're getting our tax dollars for that privilege.
100 million, you said, the Cleveland Clinic. And as you also point out, and as the story in the Cleveland Plain Dealer points out, that these were kind of commonplace and seen as acceptable. In fact, because of the Animal Welfare Act's exclusion of mice, they were in the clear to a degree. They were in the clear except for these other provisions that are based on receiving federal funds. So thank goodness for that. But still, Alka, as you know, there's a lot of people out there who are listening who aren't animal rights people necessarily, or they know people who aren't animal rights people, and they will hear something like this and say, hey, you're grousing about a couple rats and mice. You're grousing about these small mammals. Pay attention to something meaningful. Fix this COVID crisis, right? I mean, you can imagine people saying that, right?
I can indeed imagine people saying that. And, when you say fix this COVID crisis, fix, something else. Well, the COVID crisis, we all know, is, stemmed from mistreatment of animals. So our failure to see that we are all interconnected, and that our treatment of others and mistreatment of others does come back to bite us. That failure is what has led all of us to self-quarantine, has led to the collapse of our economy here in the U.S. and economies around the world. It's led to this 15% unemployment rate that was just posted this past weekend. all of these problems stem from mistreatment of animals. I think we have to get away from this insular vision that we have where we say, we should only care about people in our tribe. Historically, that has always been a problem. People only cared about white men who were affluent, and then eventually other men also counted. At some point, women, were included.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that notion of, me and mine is really what has been at the root of all of the isms that we know are problematic. The COVID crisis started with mistreatment of animals. And now we know that relying on animals in laboratories to try to solve the COVID crisis is going to waste time and money, while human relevant methods could get us faster to the solution. And thankfully, as I know that you've discussed with my colleague Jeff Brown, we're leapfrogging the use of animals, to use human relevant methods to look at different solutions to the COVID crisis. But we can't have that insular view. We can't have that navel gazing, sort of impoverished perspective on, how we think of justice and injustice. There was a pretty wise guy once upon a time who said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, Martin Luther King. And, this is true, whether we're talking about different segments of the human population, or we're talking about all of the life community, all animals and, all of the species. So I think that, that would be one thing I would say. The other thing that I would say is, do you care about where your tax money goes? And do you care about your relatives who have ALS, your loved ones who have Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or cancer or heart disease or stroke or sepsis? Do you care about finding solutions to those things? Because the way things are currently working, it's not just Cleveland Clinic, it's across the board that about half of NIH funding, grant funding, is going to animal studies. And we know that these studies are not producing human solutions for human beings. So if we care about the people, whom we love in our midst, our neighbors, our friends, our relatives, if we care about them and want to see solutions and cures and treatments to the diseases and conditions that they suffer with, what we need to do is really push for a shifting of how we spend our federal dollars and go away from antiquated, unreliable, expensive, time-consuming animal studies to human relevant technologies, which exist. PETA is helping to fund the development of even more, the validation of these methods and the adoption of these methods. But that's what we need to do.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to this. The Cleveland Clinic. You filed the complaint. NIH read it and they responded over the weekend, and we mentioned it earlier. And their response is the investigation will take place, right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
And so should they be quaking in their boots at Cleveland Clinic at the possible risk of losing their $100 million that funds all their animal experiments?
They should be quaking in their boots, because what we know from previous investigations is that although the NIH doesn't have inspectors on the ground that routinely go to inspect these facilities, for their use of mice and rats. Although there's not an army of inspectors from NIH that go out. When we submit these sorts of complaints that come out of our investigations, the NIH has in the past taken these very seriously, and they have really gone through the nuts and bolts of our complaints. They've gone through the details, and they've called the institution to answer to all of our allegations. One of the things that we saw at Cleveland Clinic while the investigator was there was that there was a third-party accreditation body that was coming through. It's called ALAC, the Association for the Assessment and Accreditation of Animal Laboratory Care, ALAC.
Right.
And so they were coming in to do what they call a site visit, not an inspection, a site visit. And for a good couple of weeks before that site visit was scheduled, people were cleaning up things and discarding expired medications, just really going to town to make sure that everything was on the up and up for the purpose of that site visit. It's not that they were doing things to make sure that their practices were on the up and up. It was to put that veneer on that facility so that the site visit would go well. And it did. But now we've got this federal agency, the National Institutes of Health, Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare, that's going to do this investigation. And they're going to be delving deep. It's not going to be somebody waltzing into a room and kind of looking around and saying, okay, this looks fine, let's go to the next room. It's going to be an agency that has the documentation. We gave them our video footage. We gave them photographs, time, place, date, experimenter name, cage number, the whole shebang. And they're going to be going through and, saying what was happening here, what was happening there, why only 2 days of pain relief, really putting, I'm hoping, putting the screws to the institution.
Well, let's hope that NIH puts them through the paces. They find out that PETA's investigation was for real and that something happens that's good. That's a good result for the animals. And once again, Alka Chandna, Vice President at PETA's Laboratory Investigations Department, I thank you for your time. Just spelling it out here, I think you were aided somewhat by having a great journalistic piece written by the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Cleveland.com. I think they lend credit. Well, you were already pretty credible, but in the public's eye, when a journalistic enterprise is fair and balanced and presents both sides, it's hard to see how NIH could do anything but come down hard on the Cleveland Clinic. So I think, I congratulate you on getting journalists to look at PETA fairly. Imagine that.
Well, we do hope that the NIH comes down strong, comes down hard on Cleveland Clinic. And I do want to say the Cleveland Clinic is a world-renowned institution. The work that they've done helping patients with COVID-19 has been tremendous. The testing that they're doing of people who are concerned that they might carry the virus is fantastic. We love Caldwell Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic, who's done groundbreaking work on heart disease and the vegan diet. But, so that is all one world and one dimension, one part of the Cleveland Clinic. This is another side, and, the two worlds don't necessarily intersect at all. This is something that we see in very large institutions. So we wouldn't want our findings from the Cleveland Clinic's animal laboratories to reflect poorly on the very good work that they do. These are two separate things. So we've been saying Cleveland Clinic, but I just want to be clear that we are talking about the animal laboratories very specifically. They need to be taken to task.
Alka Chandna, thank you very much for joining us on the PETA podcast.
It was a pleasure, Emil. Thank you so much.
Dr. Alka Chandna is a PETA Vice President in the Laboratory Investigations Department. For pictures, video, and more about the investigation into the Cleveland Clinic, go to PETA.org. And that's our program. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on the ALDEF blog, that's AALDEF.org/blog, that's the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. A is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, got some podcasts there and some columns. Also, you can find me on my own website at AMOK.com. check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.